The Miami Dolphins have a massive need at defensive tackle. So we're looking at three possible candidates for the Dolphins' first round draft selection that could fill the void next month.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, and the NFL Draft lead for the 33rd team. I want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. We are putting that NFL Draft lead at 33rd team muscle to good use here for the next month before the 2025 NFL Draft, spotlighting at some of the Dolphins' key draft selection opportunities. I have a pick right now at 13, another at 48, another at 98. Three big picks in the top 100. Hopefully they can find more draft selections at their disposal in that kind of corridor of the draft to help fill out this roster more and more. But the one thing that the Dolphins would benefit from doing is avoiding drafting explicitly for need. But there is a chance that you can have an intersection between player availability that are the best players available and a need for you on the board. We looked at a couple of positions the Dolphins could use upgrades at, but really they don't have a looming need at running back or tight end. But we looked at, and set the stage for the pick at 13. I looked at Ashton Genty and Tyler Warren yesterday on the show. A lot of the feedback was anything other than a defensive tackle or an offensive lineman is a monumental failure for the Dolphins at pick 13. And while I agree that's the perfect world that you live in, you can't force the value on the board, right? But there are a number of names that I think are reasonable to expect to be available for Miami. And we're going to look at three of those names here today at defensive tackle as candidates that I don't know that I would draft all three of these names at pick 13, but these are the three best available defensive tackles once you move past Michigan's Mason Graham. I think at least have a chance to be on the board for you. And then perhaps depending on what they choose to covet at defensive tackle, they could make the argument could be the best available player at the pick at 13 if they go with a defensive tackle. So we're going to look at Kenneth Grant from Michigan, Derrick Harmon from Oregon, and Walter Nolen from Ole Miss here today on the show. Do a spotlight on all three players and just kind of familiarize yourself with these resumes and these profiles and what these guys are bringing to the table. So let's start with Kenneth Grant, who is a popular mock draft choice for a lot of Dolphins fans for the pick at 13. Mountain of a human being, 6'3.5", 242 pounds, is a junior and blew out his pro day as far as the testing numbers for a player of his stature. Kenneth Grant is a height, weight, speed freak. He was on the Bruce Feldman's freaks list for The Athletic this past summer as far as the annual spotlight of the best athletes in college football. Kenneth Grant plays predominantly in the B gap, but I think you project him forward and there's a pretty healthy A gap sample size here of the snaps that Kenneth Grant played, and he played just over 1,000 snaps in 3 years at Michigan. About 70% of those have come in the B gap, the other 30 in the A gap. So not just a nose tackle. I think that's an important thing to impress upon when we're talking about how he moves and what he's capable of being. He ran a 5'1", 40-yard dash, had over 30-inch vertical jump, and did so at 330 pounds. He was listed and it was at the Shrine at the middle of January at 342. Okay, so there's a mass and explosiveness element here that I think if you want to see the best pass rush version of Kenneth Grant, you probably have to go back to 2023. And I felt both he and Mason Graham really were more disruptive players in 2023 when Michigan won the national championship game. But he played career high in snaps in 2024. He was effectively 550 snaps he played. It's an average of about 45 snaps per game for Michigan. So don't mistake him for a plotter. He's explosive. He is powerful. He can push the pocket. And when I get into like the synopsis and kind of the bullet points that I have on my scouting report for the 33rd team, prototypical anchor and power to reset the line of scrimmage, will dominate centers and overwhelm the A-gaps. Freakish athlete with rare movement skills for a player of his size and stature. Range along the line of scrimmage allows him to stay over top of blocks and in his gap fit. So when runs are working sideline to sideline, obviously you're a mountain in the middle. You're going to occupy space. You're going to eat blocks. You're going to keep your linebackers free. You're going to change the numbers for what you could do with coverage because you can be sound fitting gaps against the run with less people because of having a player like this in the middle. But when it goes sideline to sideline, when you get outside zone and the play side guard, you're shaded in the A-gap and you're on the inside shoulder of the offensive guard to the play side, right? And that guard tries to work across and work through your outside shoulder and start to get your body turned and gain leverage on you. At 342 pounds, this is a player who's capable and has the sideline to sideline mobility and grace to be able to extend, to keep separation between his chest and your chest, and play over the top of that to stay. Even if he's starting at a deficiency from an angles perspective, to displace the blocker and get back on the play side shoulder of those outside runs. You see him against Penn State turning and running and chasing running backs down 20-plus yards downfield. You are talking about an elite run defender in Kenneth Grant with pass rush upside that I think he's capable of being plenty productive against the pass, even though he's not a Walter Nolen, who we're going to talk about in just a little bit, as a little bit more of a extreme version of not necessarily a run defender. As far as comps, I see a lot of Dalvin Tomlinson. People want to invoke the name Dexter Lawrence, and I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that he becomes that kind of player in time. Do I think he's that player right now? No. Do I think it's probable to bet on anybody to become the next freak version of like an absolute unicorn at the position? It's probably irresponsible to do. I get why you do it. But Kenneth Grant, for me, and this is not my Dolphins specific board, and I think that's important to note here because I don't want to get into that can of worms just yet. He's a top 12 player in the class, grading him universally for all schemes and systems. Because any scheme and system, you could play him in the B gap, you could play him in the A gap. He has the ability to compress and collapse the pocket. He has sideline to sideline mobility. He has linear explosiveness. He's going to change the numbers for you. And there's pass rush ceiling to continue to tap into. And I say that like he doesn't have 50 pressures in the last 2 seasons. He's got about a 10% pressure rate for a guy playing at 342 or 339 or 331 or whatever he is on any given day. And oh, by the way, he doesn't miss tackles either. He's got a career missed tackle rate at 5%. A lot of these guys, the big guys, they'll get the backfield penetration. And then when it comes time to kind of flash and react in short spaces to make the play, they don't finish the play opportunities that they have. I want to contrast that Kenneth Grant, his missed tackle number, to Derrick Harmon, who we're going to talk about next, who I probably wouldn't draft at 13. I think there's a world in which you could build an argument that he's a player worthy of a pick in the teens. I think probably in a perfect world, he's a little later in the first round. So that might be a trade down scenario for the Dolphins if they could find one. Derrick Harmon missed 26% of his tackle attempts this year. He's got a career missed tackle rate in 4 seasons and over 1,500 snaps of 19%. Kenneth Grant's at 5%. It's an astronomical number, astronomically good number. But he does not have the pressure and disruption of a Derrick Harmon, which is a great segue for us. That's who we're looking at next here on this NFL Draft Prospect Spotlight at defensive tackle here on Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who is cutting down the nets. If you got your eye on a few underdogs this year, FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. And with tournament games happening essentially every day, there's always something to find and something exciting to get in on the action for yourself. Plus, the FanDuel app is simple to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Derrick Harmon. We just got done talking about a plus-size defensive tackle from the University of Michigan. Derrick Harmon, formerly of the University, or Michigan State University, I should say. And this was somebody who transferred this past year from Michigan State over to Oregon, was a big-time player for them on the defensive interior, arguably their best defensive player. He came into the NFL Combine this year and checked in at 6'4.5", 313 pounds with over 34-inch arms. So you're talking prototypical stature to play inside with elite length. And he paired that this past year with 55 pressures. So here's kind of the path that Derrick Harmon took as a redshirt junior who left with a year of eligibility left on his plate. He cut down weight from the time that he was at Michigan State. So he slimmed down, and it allowed him to be a more disruptive player, allowed them to play much more explosive. And you see that with the athletic testing. He ran a 4.95 at 313 pounds. So the initial burst and twitch at that size is a blend that gets you really excited. It's certainly an element of his bag that Kenneth Grant does not have. But it's still a matter of harnessing and controlling that initial burst that I think, Derrick Harmon, if he can figure it out, he's going to be a lot less of a pressures type player, and he's going to be a lot more of a sacks type player. And I know that's a hot button topic, right? First it was Jalen Phillips when Jalen Phillips first came into the league, and then it was Bradley Chubb when Bradley Chubb got acquired at the deadline. And it's like, well, the sacks aren't here, but there's pressure numbers, but you want to see players finishing plays. And then there's coaches that ideologically have their own opinions on the value of pressures and the influence and whether it's more important than sacks or not. But Derrick Harmon has the pressure element for sure. But in lateral situations, I think his hips still show a little bit of tightness. I think for a player that's slimmed down and dropped a little bit of weight, still, I think a little bit more of a linear player than maybe you'd ideally like. I think Kenneth Grant actually has a better ability to flow over top of run concepts, where Harmon is a get hip to hip inside a gap and then locate the ball and try to press to the mesh point through contact. He doesn't have a super low center of gravity. But what he does have that I think offsets some of this is an area and a play that I think would fit in quite nicely with the Dolphins, in that they ran a lot of stunts, they ran a lot of picks, they ran a lot of games, and he gets it. And you think about, when it was Christian Wilkins and Zach Sealer, and then it was Calais Campbell and Zach Sealer. Derrick Harmon, for me, when you look at how he executes whole line rush plays, he can win and overwhelm you with burst and power. And if you try to ride him out and he's in a hip-to-hip relationship with you, he's very hard to dislodge and uproot. And if he has forward momentum towards the football, more often than not, he's going to run through it. But if you're going to run a twist game and you're going to have somebody that comes crashing into a guard, and then somebody's looping behind it, and then you're supposed to, as the pick setter, parlay off that contact and get his hands clear and then redirect, and you get to the quarterback, he slingshots off of opposing bodies pretty well. Here's what I had to say as far as like the ideal scheme fit and role for Derrick Harmon. Harmon projects best as a 3-tech at the NFL level. movement skills are most impactful when playing forward, although he could play as an end on an odd front if he illustrates better leverage discipline and consistency. Harmon is likely a rotational defender early in his career before developing into a high-volume snap taker by the end of his rookie contract. So I think there's a little bit of a blurriness that exists with the Derrick Harmon projection that I don't think exists with either Kenneth Grant or Walter Nolen, who we're going to talk about next. But I do think the ceiling for Harmon, the implementation opportunities that exist here, I think it's still pretty diverse as far as if you're going to go odd front and you're going to nose tackle Zach Sealer, Derrick Harmon. He can be the other guy that's going to play on the inside shade of an offensive tackle and control the B gap because he has length. And he used to play at a much bigger, supersized stature. And case in point, prior to this year, the first 3 years that Derrick Harmon was at Michigan State, he played 19 snaps, over top of a tackle or outside. He gets to Oregon this year, and suddenly they got guys like Jordan Birch, who's another hybrid type defender who's probably a day 2 type. And there's a little bit more ambiguity. He played over 209 snaps. He played head up over offensive tackles or outside in like end or base end or 3-4 end type alignments and situations. He still played over 350 snaps in the B gap. And he's only played 57 snaps in the A gap for his career. So this is not a nose tackle type. This is a 3-tech or a penetration 4-eye that you're looking to develop. And 4-eye is like a 4 technique is the inside shoulder of an offensive tackle. You're lined up on his inside eye is the 4-eye. You're trying to develop those 34+ inch arms to punch and lock and control and read the block and process backfield action and feel pressure and fight across pressure. It's a little different school of thought than just firing through gaps, which is where he's really at his best. But this is a disruptive player, and he played a great game against Ohio State. I think that was one of the better games that he played. Really, both times they played Ohio State. He gave that Ohio State interior offensive line some fits. So Derrick Harmon, maybe a little bit of a reach at 13 based off of my assessment, but I'm also not the one making the pick. He is a defensive tackle candidate for the first round. Make of that and apply that however you would like to. The last name that I have, and when I look at my grades for defensive tackles, I really have, I think, 4 guys that have firm arguments to go in the first round. Maybe 5, but you're pushing it, and I certainly wouldn't draft a 5th player anywhere near where the Dolphins are currently scheduled to pick in the first round. It's Mason Graham, who we are operating into the assumption is that he is going to be gone in the first 12 picks. Kenneth Grant, who I think is more of a coin toss type player, whether he's there for you or not. Derrick Harmon should be there. The question is if it's too early. And then Walter Nolen is the last name that we are going to spotlight here today on the show. And he was formerly of Texas A&M, transferred to Ole Miss, had himself a heck of a season as well. So we're going to spotlight him next here on Locked on Dolphins. Stick with us. If you want to know what Walter Nolen's all about, and this is a young player, he's going to turn 22 in October, which I think is an important footnote here when you consider Kenneth Grant also turning 22 in October. Both of those guys are third-year players, where Derrick Harmon's a fourth-year player and had a redshirt year in there. So youth is on the side of guys like Nolen and Grant at defensive tackle, if you're into that sort of thing, and I know everybody's not. But Walter Nolen played his first 2 seasons after being a highly, highly, highly coveted player as a college or as a high school recruit. He lands at Texas A&M. He's a consensus 5-star recruit. He was an Under Armour All-American, 17 sacks during his time in high school with 33 tackles for loss. He had interest from pretty much a who's who of college programs and goes to Texas A&M. And as draft nicks or casual fans are finding out while they're doing research for this year's draft, just based off of Shamar Stewart and Nick Scorton, who's formerly at Purdue, as guys that play on the edge. The Texas A&M defensive system isn't exactly the most friendly for guys with explosive, twitchy athletic profiles to act like and disrupt with explosive, twitchy athletic profiles. So he transfers, Walter Nolen does, and he transfers to Ole Miss. And Ole Miss was super involved in the transfer portal. They brought in a ton of talent from outside. 6'4", 296 pounds, 32.5-inch arms, and has one of the most explosive first steps of any interior defensive lineman. And Derrick Harmon's got a good first step. Walter Nolen's is a different class and stratosphere. Just the disruptive potential that he has. I think he's the most diverse out of the group because he's the smallest out of the group. But I think it's worth noting when I watch, and I know that what the metrics say, depending on how much stock you put in the websites to do the grading and give a number out of 100 and apply it to a player. The metrics say this is a very, very well-rounded player. But when I watch this player, I think he's a scheme-specific type of fit, and that's some of the question that I have as far as what the every down role looks like for Walter Nolen. Now, if you told me that the Dolphins drafted Walter Nolen, my first question would be, is it at 13 or did you get back a little bit? But it's very easy to get excited about a guy who, he had about a 10% pass rush pressure rate on the interior. That's about equal to Kenneth Grant. He doesn't have the length as Kenneth Grant. He doesn't have the length of Walter Nolen or of Derrick Harmon. He is a penetration player through and through. He is going to create a lot of chaos. He's a gap shooter. And as a result, there's a boom or bust element that exists there in run defense, especially for what you perceive the Dolphins front to be with guys like Calais Campbell and Deshaun Hand and Benito Jones. And Walter Nolen would never play Benito Jones A-gap reps, right? I think that's important to note here. He actually played 50 snaps in the A-gap as a true freshman in 2022. Last year's he's played 13 and 19. So it didn't take Ole Miss 2 years to figure out, don't put this guy in the A-gap like it did with Texas A&M. Stereotypical 3 technique, but does not, I think, have the front multiplicity that I get excited about with the Derrick Harmon. So for me, I think his ceiling is even front, pass rush situation, or you're going to just embrace your front is not necessarily going to play on even levels, and you're going to be a little bit more of a single gap control type of defense. That to me flies a little bit in conflict, at least with some of what the Dolphins have with their other pieces right now and what this scheme is presumably supposed to be built upon. Now, I do think you do have the opportunity to put him in different spots based off of he is so explosive. He will play at times like an edge defender with the twitch off the edge. So it's really just a matter of what kind of flavor you want or you prefer if you're getting into the realm that Mason Graham is gone. Let's say Kenneth Grant is gone. Do you live in a world in which either Derrick Harmon or Walter Nolen is the best player available? It's a matter of are you going to lean into the pass rush value of those reps? But I think Derrick Harmon has more outcomes to play on early downs early and not compromise the rest of your pillars. It's a really fascinating discussion, and it's part of why I don't think you can just sit here and pigeonhole the Dolphins need to draft a defensive tackle at number 13. But this is a worthy player from a film and traits resume of getting drafted in the right situation to go in the top 32 picks with Walter Nolen. It's a bet high prospect. He's still learning how to put all of the tools in his toolbox together, because for all of the disruption that he has, and I know he didn't play as many games or as many snaps as what Derrick Harmon did, but Walter Nolen leaves Ole Miss with 35 pressures on 587 total snaps and his 362 pass rush snaps. You contrast that to Derrick Harmon. Derrick Harmon, 55 pressures on 346. So they played almost the same amount of snaps. Now, Harmon didn't play as many on a per-game basis. If I had to stack them, it's Kenneth Grant, it's Derrick Harmon, it's Walter Nolen. It's the order in which we did them. And I know people are going to see just the raw athletic traits of Walter Nolen, and they're going to gravitate towards that. And I get that, and I understand that. But if I'm drafting a guy, especially a defensive tackle, with a pick in the top 15, I kind of have a certain expectation for workload. I have a certain expectation for not just being a short yardage and first down player. And just like I don't have expectation that you're just going to be a third down package player. I feel like Kenneth Grant can do that. And I think Kenneth Grant has a lot of room to grow into being like a dominant player in both phases. I think Derrick Harmon has the ability to fulfill both of those phases, just in different roles with different front structures. Whereas Walter Nolen, for me, is the one who I think has the most narrow path to being successful, but may ultimately, in the right situation, be the most disruptive out of any of them. Are you willing to provide that for him? Or do you see other players as better fits? And that's all part of the jigsaw puzzle that you have to put together. Or alternatively, you can look a little bit further down the board and you could look at names like Darius Alexander and TJ Sanders, who I think is a great second day two option to a Walter Nolen for an undersized penetration pass rush type player. Tylik Williams is a run stuffer, and Alfred Collins and Shamar Turner and Jordan Phillips and Jamari Caldwell and Omar Norman Lott and Vernon Broughton and Joshua Farmer and Aeneas People. It's a really, really deep defensive tackle group. And that's what I hope you carry away from this is there's some compelling options at 13. But I also do not look at defensive tackle and say we are painted into a corner here. It's boom or bust at 13 for a player that can be a meaningful contributor. Now, don't draft somebody at 98 and expect them to be your running mate to Zach Sealer and not do anything else at the position. You're going to have to get creative and find some other solutions. That's going to do it for us here today, looking at defensive tackle options in the first round for Miami. You can keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys, as always, for checking out the show. Make it a great rest of your day. I'll be back to talk to you all again soon with more Miami Dolphins football talk.